The White House defending President Biden's record and his intention to run as they hold the first presser after the debate. That's as a new Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity is allowing former President Trump to delay his New York sentencing. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao reports.
The White House says President Biden is getting out there to speak to the American public as he's seeking to turn the page on last week's debate.
We understand the concerns. We get it. The president did not have a great night. The president had a cold. He had a hoarse voice. We want to turn the page on this. And we want to turn the page for the American people as well, because we know that they need to see him out there.
The White House announced that this week President Biden will campaign in Wisconsin, speak to Democratic leaders, and also do a sit-down interview with ABC. He's also holding a press conference next week at the NATO Summit in D.C. The White House also cites his latest public appearances, including one today addressing extreme heat.
We're going to face this summer. It's going to be significant.
And one over the weekend at a rally.
When you get knocked down, you get back up.
And as President Biden ramps up his public messaging, former President Trump is trying to get his legal cases all thrown out. Trump's team on Tuesday successfully got an okay from the judge in Trump's New York case to postpone his sentencing from July to September, citing the need to consider the implication from the latest Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. And Trump is now calling for, quote, total exoneration in the several cases against him. It's unclear how the Supreme Court ruling will impact the outcome of Trump's cases, but the delay in Trump's New York sentencing means that Trump will not be sentenced before the Republican National Convention to begin on July 15th. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
The Supreme Court's presidential immunity ruling is shaking things up in former President Trump's New York criminal case. As we just heard, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg says he will not oppose Trump's motion to delay his sentencing. Joining me now to assess the implications of the High Court's presidential immunity ruling is former Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill. Former Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. Attorney General, breaking earlier today, Donald Trump's sentencing for hush money, the so-called hush money case, likely to be delayed for at least 2 weeks. This in light of the Supreme Court's historic ruling yesterday. Are we already seeing the reverberations of this ruling? What might this mean for that case in New York?
Well, the case in New York, in my estimation, was always shaky anyway in terms of the initial effort by the Manhattan DA. What we're seeing now is this thrust of a new immunity situation that the Supreme Court has determined that the President of the United States enjoys immunity for conduct that's official in its nature. So I think the Trump team is rightfully so requesting time to consider what that new Supreme Court holding does potentially for the case in New York, setting aside some time to determine if any of the acts or conduct in which the allegations that were brought forth could be considered official and therefore qualify as immune for prosecution.
And to your point, the ruling stated that a president cannot be prosecuted for their actions within their constitutional authority, extending that immunity to the outer perimeter of official duties. What does this ultimately mean for, I guess, the biggest event in question, which was that January 6th speech?
Well, I think what has to happen now is it's not all clear sailing. The case needs to go back for further evaluation or analysis as to what is official conduct. The immunity is very clear that if it's a constitutional authority or official conduct, the president is immune from any prosecution. So someone may have to determine what is the definition of official conduct. And for the executive branch or any government official, that can sometimes be tricky because there are clearly things that the president does that are absolutely official conduct, executing, signing a bill into law, things that only he can do. But there's other things that are sort of interesting. I mean, the president of the United States is always the president. You don't shut down at 5 o'clock or 10 o'clock. It's a round-the-clock position. Even when you're engaged in political activity, that can be considered official capacity. So it makes for a very interesting analysis in terms of what's going to be considered official conduct versus unofficial conduct. It certainly doesn't clear anyone from obvious crimes that could occur, but for crimes that need to be evaluated, or in the case that we're facing now in New York and some of the other prosecutions, made up, when they are simply allegations that are being made up for political purposes, it does put some extra oomph into the analysis to make a determination of whether or not it's official conduct.
It's really an excellent analysis on the matter. And, you know, the Supreme Court, although this particular ruling is taking the limelight right now, they were extremely busy over the past week or so. On Friday, they overruled the Chevron doctrine, which required courts to defer to federal agencies' interpretations of ambiguous statutes. How has Chevron enabled federal agencies to overreach Congress's intent?
Well, the original Chevron doctrine has been one of the worst things that could have happened in American jurisprudence, because it empowered or emboldened federal agencies to interpret their own rules without government or without court intervention. And it's been a real sticking point for the last 40 plus years. Alleviating the Chevron rule from the system is one of the best things that could happen in terms of being able to control that beast that we call a bureaucracy. It means that there can be court intervention to determine what the appropriate rules are, and it requires Congress to do its job. We don't want Congress to be overladen with minutia, which is part of what the original Chevron decision was all about, making sure that Congress didn't have to be involved in in every little nook and cranny of legislative process. But it has gone so far that the unelected bureaucrats have been controlling the shots for a number of years. And so now we get some parity back into the system to make sure that we don't have bureaucracies running amok. It's also has impacted the states. Even though the Chevron decision was a federal case, the implication was that state agencies were able to provide their own direction short of court intervention. So it's a very solid ruling for those of us who believe in freedom.
Former Indiana AG Curtis Hill, really appreciate your analysis.
Thank you very much.
And Washington, D.C. is gearing up for heightened security next week as world leaders are set to arrive for NATO's annual summit in the nation's capital. The alliance is expected to announce new action to support Ukraine, the appointment of a new Secretary General, and more. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has the story.
The mayor of D.C. and the FBI warned Washingtonians of heightened levels of security next week. The leaders of 32 NATO member states and 5 other nations will participate in the military alliance's annual summit, which will span from July 9th through the 11th.
And the summit has been designated a national special security event. Let me put it simply. Next week is not going to be a regular week in D.C. We anticipate the summit will increase traffic throughout the city.
It should be lost on no one that D.C. on a normal day is a target-rich environment for potential threat actors. As such, we would like to remind the public to remain vigilant and report any suspicious activity to law enforcement.
This year's summit marks the 75th anniversary of the military alliance, and one of its most important accomplishments in recent years is its increased investment in member capabilities.
At the summit in Washington, more support to Ukraine will be our most urgent task. I strongly welcome that this year a record of 23 allies, including France, will invest at least 2% of GDP on defense.
Since former President Donald Trump pressured NATO member states back in 2017 to fulfill the 2% GDP defense spending pledge, compliance has increased fourfold. And former President Trump reminded the American audience of this in last week's presidential debate.
And the only reason that he can play games with NATO is because I got them to put up hundreds of billions of dollars. I said, and he's right about this, I said, no, I'm not going to support NATO if you don't pay.
Mark Rutte, former Dutch Prime Minister, will replace Jens Stoltenberg as NATO's new Secretary General. And NATO is set to announce a new plan to coordinate assistance to Ukraine. Some 700 allied troops, including U.S. service members, will be stationed in a military base in Germany to manage logistics. The U.S. is also expected to announce new air defense assistance to Ukraine. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
And a close primary race in Virginia's 5th District officially ending in defeat for incumbent Congressman and Freedom Caucus Chair Bob Good. He lost by a razor-thin margin of 0.6%, just under 400 votes, but says he does plan to call for a recount. Virginia's election board today certifying the win of Virginia State Senator and former Navy SEAL John McGuire. The race was seen as a test of the power of former President Trump's endorsement. Trump threw his support behind McGuire after Bob Good initially supported Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in the presidential race. Former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy also targeting Good for voting to oust him from his post as House Speaker last year. Good's loss will mean the Congressional House Freedom Caucus will have to choose a new chair after the November election. Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.